Test, test, test. Test. Testing 1, 2. Test 1, 2. Test, test. Test, test, test. Test, test. Test, test.
Okay. Good afternoon. Hi. I'm Kathy Harrington. I'm an associate professor at UAB and a senior scientist in the Lung Health Center. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about electronic cigarettes and vaping. And just out of curiosity, has anyone in here ever tried an electronic cigarette? Okay, we've got a few. Do any of you have friends or family that use them? Okay. Can somebody tell me what they're using them for?
Replace the cigarettes.
Replace cigarettes. Anybody using them to quit?
Yeah, they can.
Or just in place of cigarettes where they can't use them? Both. Okay. So I don't have any financial relationships or affiliations to disclose. And the objectives today are just to explain what electronic cigarettes are like. They're changing. We're in our second and third generation of them. What they look like, what their use is like among both adults and youth. We'll talk about the scientific evidence related to their health effects and potential health effects, both positive and negative, and then discuss considerations for your patients. So first of all, here's what it looks like. Now, those of you who are not that familiar with them may not realize that when you see somebody either walking down the street in a car and there's a tremendous cloud around their heads, that's vaping. So that's one of the main ways you can tell, is they really are walking in a cloud. As far as what the actual devices look like, well, first let me tell you, they were only developed in 2003. So they're pretty new. They're disruptive to the tobacco market. The patent actually said it was an electronic atomization cigarette that functions as substitutes for quitting smoking and cigarette substitutes. Now, our FDA does not allow them to advertise as a quit aid. They're primarily manufactured in China. They were a lot of small different companies that were developing them, but now Big Tobacco has taken over most of the major products. They actually deliver an aerosol vapor that may or may not have nicotine. Now, when I'm talking about them, mostly what I'm going to talk about is with nicotine because that's how they're most commonly used. But keep in mind that they can be nicotine-free. Anyway, they create a vapor by heating nicotine, propylene glycol, or glycerin with or without additional flavoring agents. They call it juice, and it can be, as I mentioned, nicotine-free. So here's what they look like, and there's even more products than this, but they're called a lot of different things. So when I refer to an electronic cigarette, I also mean a vaping device, okay? Because now there's not very many that look like a cigarette anymore. That's how they started out. Although I understand there's a brand new device that we do not yet have in this country that looks like a cigarette. It heats the solution, but it doesn't heat it as much as the ones that are on the market now. And supposedly that's supposed to be a healthier alternative. I know the FDA is looking at it right now, so I don't know whether that's going to come here or not. But people call them electronic nicotine delivery system, ENDS. That's usually a scientist. You'll never hear somebody on the street say that. They'll call them e-cigarettes. They also call them e-cigars if they're a bigger version. E-hookah, hookah sticks, vaping devices, vapes, vape pens, mods and tanks. The mods and tanks are the bigger ones. Sometimes they're square. They almost look like a little cigarette packet with a pipe sticking out of the end. So the first generation looked a lot like a cigarette. They had a very limited battery life. They had low nicotine delivery. It took a long time to build up nicotine in the blood, so they were not a great substitute for somebody that wanted something instead of a cigarette. Then the second generation are larger refillable tanks, and then the third generation almost deliver the same nicotine and almost as quickly as a traditional cigarette, but not quite. So the juice constituents are primarily nicotine in varying levels. Carrier solutions, as I mentioned, it's either propylene glycol or vegetable glycerin, and then flavorings, tobacco, mint, cinnamon, candy, fruit, wine. Did anyone ever go to the beer festival at Sloss Furnace where they had a big e-cigarette display in the front with about 60 or 70 different flavors you could try for free? I always wanted to try the tiramisu, but I never made it. Anyway, so one of the issues that they found as they're starting to do some research on the juice is that the nicotine amount that's labeled doesn't always match what's been found. So the manufacturing conditions are not as well quality controlled as one would hope. Then each puff that you take can deliver between none and about 35 ultragrams, whatever that UG is, of nicotine. So it's as much as you can get in a cigarette, or now even more. Propylene glycol, historically it was used as to keep tobacco kind of moist, and it was considered safe, but nobody had ever looked at it for inhalation standards. And vegetable glycerin, generally recognized as safe also, but again, nobody's really looked at the aerosol and how it can cause problems. So the acrolein that results from heating it really does create irritation in the lungs. And then the flavorings, certain flavorings have been found to be very harmful. I know cherry was one flavor that early on was described as having harmful effects beyond regular flavorings. And as we know, menthol makes it easier to inhale. Interestingly, I went to a conference where they talked about some of the experiments they were doing with electronic cigarettes, and one of them was to add citric acid to the solution or the juice because it gave a harsher hit on the back of the throat, and people who were smokers and using vapes to try and quit found out that it gave them a more instant sense of satisfaction to their urge for nicotine. So it's sort of interesting how they've come around to changing the juice to try to be more satisfying to smokers. So what we want to know a lot about is how safe or risk-free this is. It's not risk-free. Is it safer than cigarettes? Probably yes. So the carcinogens are much lower order. Every research article you read will give you a different amount. I think there's pretty much agreement that it's much lower. It contains some carcinogens, but at a much lower level than cigarettes. It does have particulate, very similar to what you get in tobacco smoke, and they have also found that the compounds vary greatly based on the juice or the manufacturer. As you may know, looking at all the vape shops around, people do a lot of their own juices. They mix and match and come up with their own solutions. So there's no real quality control right now. So you can get them anywhere. And vape shops, which I know you all have seen, you can get them in the regular grocery store, department store. You can pretty much get them anywhere. And what's really sort of concerning is, well, you're not supposed to get them if you're under the age of 21. You can order them online. All you have to do is click and say you're over 21, and then you have whatever it is you want. And that's concerning. So I wanted to talk a little bit about e-cigarette trends. And as you can see, since 2010, when they really started to become a little more popular, the amount of use. And so when we talk about current use, we talk about within the last 30 days. So those of you that rose your hands when I said, did you ever try an electronic cigarette? If you raised your hand, you were saying yes, you would be counted as ever use versus current use is last 30 days. Now, it may be that you happen to have experimented in the last 30 days and you would be sort of misclassified as a current user. But what we found in 2000 and these are trends from 2010 to 2013, and I just wanted to show you the difference in the two studies. You can see one found much higher rates than the others. So we know that a lot depends on who you're asking, where you're asking, how you're asking. These were two very different populations. Both of them were population-based, but the way they recruited their participants was very different, which probably accounts for the difference. One used an online recruitment, and they may have gotten more as a result. So the National Adult Tobacco Study found even greater differences. They found a higher rate for ever use and a lower rate for current use. So what is the real use? We don't know. So this is 2014, and you can see that ever use is at about 3.7 to 4.9%, depending on which study you look at. Interestingly, the 2015-16 data just came out, and they're saying adult regular use is down to 3.2%. So that's a declining use. And it may be because people that were experimenting or using it either have quit or it's just the market is saturated at some extent. So this is among smokers. So if you look at it, current smokers use, it's the lighter blue line, they're more likely to use electronic cigarettes than the general population, obviously. And former smokers, and when we say former, we mean recent, they've quit within the last year, and then long ago smokers. So we're seeing that people are using it or trying to use it as a quit aid. And this is current use. You can see the current use is lower than the ever use, but it's still pretty high, looking at some of these studies among smokers. What the most recent data I could find in 2015 suggested that about 60% of people that use electronic cigarettes are smokers, and about 30% are former smokers. So the majority of people who are using electronic cigarettes are former or current smokers. What I don't know is how long ago they quit. So for the former smokers, they may be recent quitters and this was their device for quitting. We don't know that. So, so satisfaction with vaping. Do any of you have any friends who have switched from regular traditional cigarettes to electronic cigarettes? Nobody? A couple of you? Okay, so I have a friend who recently has, and I would say about 6 months now he's been using an electronic cigarette, and all he complains about is how less satisfying it is. But the fact of the matter is the companies that are producing these are working very hard to improve satisfaction. The throat hit. I mentioned the addition of citric acid to the vape juice to try and make it have a stronger throat hit, because apparently with traditional cigarettes, as soon as they feel that smoke in the back of their throat, it's a little bit rough and it makes them feel more satisfied, because I think it triggers the idea that I'm about to get some nicotine. So it's kind of a anticipatory reflex. And then their relief of the urge to smoke. A lot of people using this, they're using them because they've got an urge to smoke, they want some nicotine, this is a way to get it. How well the mouthpiece fits their mouth. They're working on that all the time to improve the comfort and draw resistance. So if you have to really breathe more deeply, it's called vape topography. It's how you inhale, and it can influence how much nicotine you get, just same as with a cigarette. The deeper you draw on it, the more you're going to get. And then the vape cloud. Believe it or not, the vape cloud is really, they like it for the most part. So when you look at their overall satisfaction, the ones that they refill themselves, and those are usually the tanks or the mods, they're usually a little bit bigger, they're a little bit stronger battery, a little bit more juice can fit in there, easier to draw on. They tend to have higher satisfaction than the ones that look more like traditional cigarettes. So, of concern to the public health community is the any youth use of tobacco, obviously. So we've done a great job in this country of reducing youth tobacco, but we're seeing a reemergence with electronic cigarettes. So middle school in 2016, 4.3%, and high school, 11.3%. Overall, tobacco products, as you can see, e-cigarettes are more popular right now than traditional tobacco cigarettes. Unfortunately, what we do see as the children age up, we see more and more of them becoming traditional tobacco users. So there is new evidence that has just come out within the last couple months that indicates that yes, in fact, electronic cigarettes appear to be a gateway to traditional smoking. So that's kind of unfortunate. Now, we would see a little bit of that anyway, but we're seeing it in a higher rate than we would expect. So the good news is we have a downward trend for the first time. So we've been monitoring youth trends for a while, and it's been going up, and that's been of concern. But now, for the first time in the past year, we're seeing a decline in everyday use or current use and in ever trying them. We're not really sure why. We don't know if maybe sort of some of the evidence when they thought they were completely safe is getting hurt. We don't know. We don't know. But what we do know is if you look at this trend, this is how much money was spent on youth, on advertising to youth, and on advertising and then use by youth. And you can see that one trend follows the other. So, not to say that it's being marketed to children, but this is some of the ads for electronic cigarettes. So of those who have used an electronic cigarette, 68% have used a flavor. Looking at this ad, it's not a surprise, or any of these ads. These are different ads. So it is clearly being marketed to specific audiences regardless of what our laws say. So secondhand vapor, people have asked me about that a lot because they'll be, most of our indoor smoking laws banned vaping as well as smoking, but it used to be that wasn't the case, and people were really concerned to be in a bar or somewhere and be standing next to somebody, or even be on the street and stand next to somebody who's got this huge cloud of vapor around their head and they're inhaling it. And like, does it bother me? Well, the truth is there's no side stream smoke, obviously, because there's no burning product. But there are some toxins in the vapor, and if you stand close enough to somebody, you do get nicotine. And in fact, I have a colleague who was in a small office with a student who was vaping as they were working together, and he started to get a little dizzy, and he finally realized that it was the nicotine from the vapor because he's a non-nicotine user, and it was bothering him. So yes, there is that possibility, but there's no burn products like there are in secondhand smoke. So this is just to look at some particulate concentration, and this is different smoke samples, and this is different vapor samples, and I'm just showing them to you to show you it's not just water. So some people think the vapor is just just like a mist, just a water mist, and it's not. There is more to it. So the health effects. I think everybody is pretty interested in health effects. What we know is that there are some systemic effects. Most of them that have been studied have been cardiac and respiratory. We know the effect of nicotine on the heart. That's no different regardless of how you get it. There's still an impact on the heart. But for the respiratory, there is an inflammatory response that looks exactly, the initial inflammatory response looks exactly the same for electronic cigarette vapor as it does for traditional cigarettes. So there is some concern that it's impacting the lungs, but we don't really know what the long-term effects are going to be. We also know that there's some immune effects, that it reduces immunity, similar to cigarette smoke also does. And then there's nicotine poisoning. Now, this has been found mostly among youth, where they ingest the e-liquid. There's been more calls to poison control centers because of that. And so there's caution now about storing the e-liquid. But we also know that for folks who are dual users, and what we have found in our population, I run the tobacco consult service at UAB Hospital, and among our patients, we found about 85% of electronic cigarette users also are cigarette smokers. And their intention for many of them was to start using this in place of cigarettes, but then what happened actually was that they were intaking more nicotine, and some of them have had problems with mild nicotine poisoning because they've really increased their nicotine intake by being dual users. So that's a little bit of a concern. None of them that I'm aware of have had a really serious side effect, but they have not felt well, and a couple of them have ended up in the emergency room not being sure what was happening. And then there's the mechanical injury. I know you've all heard about the battery explosions, why you can't take an electronic cigarette on an airplane because the battery's exploding. Of course, the companies that are producing these products are working very hard to make them safer in terms of the batteries and how they're made. So this is just to illustrate among non-smokers and smokers both that the blood vessel impact and oxidative stress are very similar before and after traditional cigarettes and e-cigarettes. So the difference is very similar for both non-smokers and smokers. So we know that it still has an impact, and that's probably a lot of that is the nicotine. So the actual impact, and this is why it's been so very difficult for us to be able to come up with recommendations to the FDA on exactly how and why they should be or not why they should be regulated, but how, is that the brands vary and that the quality among brands is very, very different. The type of device, so think about this, the bigger the battery and the stronger the nicotine content, the more you're going to get. The bigger the hit you're going to get, the more nicotine that's going to be in your system, and the more particles and the more vapor mist that gets in your system. So you can really manipulate, unlike traditional cigarettes, you know, you can manipulate them a little bit. You can put holes in the filter like they did for the light cigarettes, and you get a little bit less unless you hold your finger over it. And you can, you know, but basically a cigarette's a cigarette. Yeah, filtered or unfiltered, but there weren't that many differences. Now that is not the case. It is all over the map. And then flavor additives. So we know that some flavor additives can have a big effect. Think about menthol. This is true for cigarettes as well as electronic cigarettes. You give somebody menthol, it eases the throat. So you take a deeper breath. You inhale more, you inhale deeper. So you gain more, you get more absorption in the lungs. And then we have puffing pattern. So that's the duration and frequency. With cigarettes, we have the same thing, but we see more of this with electronic cigarettes. You will see people let out this gigantic stream when they exhale, and that is because they've inhaled more of it. And they were able to do that because of the device they're using, as well as perhaps flavoring. Think about how different flavorings, interestingly, not all flavorings have the same impact. For instance, chocolate as a flavoring reduces satisfaction and inhalation. People don't seem to care as much for chocolate. Menthol, we know, increases it. Cherry can be, I know cherry is detrimental. I think there's one or two others, and I can't tell you off the top of my head what they are. But given that there are literally probably 100 different flavors out there, and you can mix and match. If you like strawberry banana, you can, you know, mix and match and come up with that. So it's really what you want to get. And then you can vary the nicotine content. You can go all the way from nothing to a lot. I have a friend who, this is a true story, wanted to lose some weight, and she decided she was drinking too much wine, and that might have been contributing to her weight issue. Decided that she was going to get an electronic cigarette that was wine flavored juice, and that was going to be her answer to her wine issue, and it didn't work quite as she expected. But anyway, but that was how she was thinking, that, oh, this is great, a calorie-free glass of wine. Anyway, and then the other thing is battery voltage. We know the higher the voltage, the hotter the liquid gets, and the more that you get the nicotine into the lungs. So those bigger devices you see, higher battery, you could still be nicotine-free. But most of the people that we talk to that use electronic cigarettes use nicotine. And if you talk to youth, they don't know. Many of them do not know. So that's of concern to us. However, there are some potential health gains, and I would be remiss if I don't talk about them, because I think the jury is out. We're still trying to figure out exactly what and how they should be regulated, in what manner, and who should have access and how they should get it. We also have to consider quality control. You know, until we come out with some decisions about that, we don't know about quality control. So this scenario assumes that you are replacing all cigarettes among all smokers with electronic cigarettes for 10 years. Now, that assumes that you will have between 1.6 and 6.6 million premature deaths avoided. Now, why the range? The range is because there are different scenarios based on how much nicotine are in the products, at what rate they're adopted, etc. So basically 1.6 assumes pretty high nicotine content, 6.6 much lesser content. Same thing with millions of life years saved between 20 and 87. Or 21 and 87. That's a lot of life years. But that's making an assumption that every single smoker is going to drop their cigarettes and pick up electronic cigarettes. But that's the potential impact from a public health standpoint. Now, for youth, so this is at the younger age, at about 15, which is what the youngest age they looked at this scenario, they said they would extend their life expectancy by a half a year if they just this year didn't use a traditional cigarette but stuck with electronic cigarettes. So we do know that among those who smoke and switch to electronic cigarettes, they have a reduction in blood pressure, they have better lung function, they have fewer disease symptoms, especially for asthma and COPD, and they have improved mood and memory. We're not sure why the improved mood. Maybe it's the flavors they're smoking or vaping, we don't know, but improved memory. We think this has to do with that they actually are getting less nicotine, but we're not sure. So there are some very positive aspects to this. So one of the questions most people think of when they think of electronic cigarettes, do they really help with people to quit smoking? Does that mean if you're using them, you're more likely to quit? How many in here have heard of somebody using them specifically to replace cigarettes but not to quit? Okay, to use long term. Okay, so you do hear that. Some smokers are wanting to do it long term. Others are thinking they'll use it temporarily until they quit. So this is the evidence. These are all the studies this is a meta-analysis done in 2015, and it looked at some of the early studies. There are more studies coming out all the time. But right now, the evidence suggests that that doesn't help. And the reason that we believe that is because we're prolonging the nicotine addiction. And most of this work was done with what we call first-generation electronic cigarettes, where it was not as good at nicotine delivery as the current ones are, the second and third generation. So what we think happens a lot is you keep your nicotine addiction, you sort of change the behavior, because unlike a traditional cigarette that's a hand-to-mouth, occasional thing, most people that vape all the time will hold the device to their mouth and puff nonstop for a certain amount of time. So it's a very different kind of behavior. Not very different, but it is different. It's still a hand-to-mouth. So we think that what happened early on was that the electronic cigarettes just weren't satisfying enough because they didn't deliver enough nicotine. So the evidence is very mixed. The more robust studies, and by robust I mean better study design, less bias in their population, kind of better study methods, seem to indicate that some smokers are absolutely helped by vaping. But we really need more high quality studies. The evidence is not strong enough, and it's not consistent enough. If you look at enough articles, you'll find an argument for whatever it is you want to believe. So we have some public health concerns, and I've mentioned some of them, and that is the addiction potential for both smokers and non-smokers. Interestingly, we only have about 1.5 or 2% of the population of adults who have never smoked who use electronic cigarettes. I think my friend on the wine diet was one of them. But we just don't see that. And think about this from a tobacco standpoint. 95% of anyone who ever smokes starts before the age of 25. So what we do not see this as a behavior that is adopted later in life. So it's not a big surprise that electronic cigarettes aren't adopted either. But what we are seeing, this last year was, 2016 was the first year we saw a reduction. It'll be interesting when we get the 2017 data to see if that trend towards fewer youth continues. Because we do have a concern also that, you know, there was a time in, those of you that watched Mad Men may recall that everyone's smoking. That was sort of the, that was the thing. You know, it was very glamorous. It was normal behavior. You know, I think in the 50s, something like 48% of the adult population smoked. I mean, things have changed a lot, but we're worried about a return to that sort of glamour and normal behavior. Most of us now, we see the smokers outside the entrance to wherever it is we're going, or I don't know, do you all have a smoking pits here at St. Vincent's? Do you have a smoke-free campus? Good for you. That's awesome. We at UAB still have 7 smoking pits attached to our hospital, sadly. That's the problem when you don't have a distinct campus and you've got Birmingham city streets, you know, 5 feet from your door. But anyway, we're working on it, but we're not there yet. So, but you know, has become kind of a shunned behavior in our culture, and we've got some concern. I mean, because it's not healthy, we're sort of glad that it's not considered glamorous anymore, but we are concerned that this is changing, especially because kids love technology, and these new devices are very technological. So it has not been approved by the FDA as a smoking cessation aid because the evidence is not strong enough to support that yet. It does maintain what we call combusted tobacco use, so it keeps smokers going back to traditional burning cigarettes, and there is an increase in poisoning from the juice, and battery explosions. So there's some injury related to it, but it's a pretty small percent. The bigger concern really has to do with how is this impacting tobacco use across the board. So there is a current regulation that you all may have heard about that came out a few years back that they were going to oversee electronic cigarettes or vape device as a drug because it contains nicotine, because it comes from a tobacco product. They're going to see it like they do cigarettes. They're going to rule on it. So they were going to improve quality control and production standards. Right now there really aren't any, so that's really important. There are no sales under 18 years of age, health warning labels similar to what they're putting on cigarette packs, no vending machine sales, no marketing implying that it's healthy or safe. If you look at the marketing, boy, they skirt all of these because they say things like, so they can't advertise it as a smoking cessation aid, so what they say is may help with quitting. So that they put conditions, or they'll say appears to be safer than regular cigarettes. So there's a lot of conditioning that they put in their marketing because they're not allowed to do that. So there are grandfathered in. You might wonder why, if the FDA is ruling on it, do we still have them without the standards in place? And that's because they gave them a grandfather in period. So they were supposed to, March of 2018, so 2 months ago, they were supposed to come out with their rules and their regulations. They've postponed it to 2022. And the reason they've postponed it is because there's too much research still going on and there's not enough answers. So to really do this the right way, they've postponed it. One of the things that's happened since they postponed it last month, the American Academy of Pediatrics has filed a suit, and now a lot of others have followed, but the APA was first, filed a suit against the FDA for not enacting this sooner because there's such concern about youth initiation and use of tobacco product. So the jury's still out. We'll have to wait and see what they come up with. So here are some of the key points that I wanted to talk about. They're tobacco products. There are a few without nicotine, but that is the minority. The majority is with tobacco. Youth who vape are more likely to progress to traditional cigarettes. Juice and aerosol are found to contain toxins that include nicotine, ultrafine particles, and some carcinogens, admittedly at a much lower rate than traditional cigarettes. So they're not risk-free. There are some negative health effects They are not as high as traditional smoking, but they are much higher than no smoking at all. The other thing is, we don't know what the long-term effects are. You know, these products have only been around since 2003 and only really been popular in this country starting in about 2008. So it's 10 years, so we don't know long-term. And very mixed reports about effectiveness for smoking cessation. If you ever meet somebody that quit using electronic cigarettes, they are really advocates for their use because it worked for them. So one size may not fit all. So here's a dilemma. We've got both positive and negatives. What do we do? What would you advise your patients? Well, the public health experts go back and forth. There's two arguments. One is they aren't safe. They maintain and promote nicotine addiction. We know that's not good. But on the other hand, they're safer than smoking cigarettes, and we call that the harm reduction argument. So let's do less harm. Let's advocate for less harm. So there's two sides. So what can you do in your clinical practice? Now, for youth, I don't think there's any question. You know, I don't know if you all screen in your pediatric population for tobacco use or exposure, or if you screen for electronic cigarettes. Does anyone know? Well, we've started screening everyone 13 and over for electronic cigarette use. Unfortunately, we usually ask them in front of their parents, and so we don't get, we get the same answer we get. Do you smoke? Nah. Do you drink? Nah. Use drugs? Nah. Well, you know, so one of the things we need to do is do a better job of screening our patients in an environment where they can answer us honestly. But we do know that it is not healthy for any youth to put anything in their lungs like that. So we would absolutely advocate for youth not to vape. Now, there may be youth that are already traditional cigarette users, and what do we tell them? Well, we tell them to quit smoking. Hopefully they're not too addicted yet and they can quit, but you have to first find out that they are smokers, and that's sometimes tough to find out with youth. So we would also advise the parents or caregivers not to use electronic cigarettes, not to leave them around for their kids, and to be very careful about the juice, because there is still concern that younger children especially would have nicotine poisoning from the juice. And it doesn't take very much to be fatal. It's a small amount, so it's a pretty serious thing. So I don't think there's a question about youth. There's no debate there. But what about your adult smokers in your clinical practice? What would you advocate for them? So here is what our recommendation is, and this recommendation comes from others as well. It is a highly debated topic among my colleagues and myself. We talk about this all the time. What do we do? So first we assess for vaping. Because if you ask somebody if they're a smoker and they're vaping, they're probably going to tell you no. They consider it different. Now, right now, because we have such a high percentage that are dual users, probably close to 60%, if they ask if they're smoking, you might, and then you say how many cigarettes a day, and they go 4 or 5. That doesn't sound so bad, but then they're also vaping a considerable amount. So you need to take both into consideration. Of course, advise no tobacco use. There is no safe tobacco use of any kind. And then, you know, advocate to quit any tobacco use, and refer them to tobacco cessation services. You know, we have a quit line in this state that will provide up to 8 weeks of nicotine patches for free. So that's one resource. I don't know what other resources you have here at St. Vincent's, but if you have them, use them. And assist, if the patient's interested, assist them with pharmacotherapy to aid a quit attempt. Nicotine patches, bupropion, which is also called Zyban or Wellbutrin, or varenicline, which is also called Chantix. nicotine gum, nicotine inhalers. Now they have nicotine lozenges, I think nicotine lollipops. There's a lot of different forms of nicotine replacement that you can offer them depending on their preference. However, there's a lot of patients that are going to tell you, not interested. I just don't think I can do it. Or I've tried all of the things you're recommending before. And then you start thinking about harm reduction. What can we do to help this patient with, especially if they have a tobacco-related health issue? It's probably of more concern, but it would be concern for anybody. So counsel that vaping is not risk-free. There is a belief among some that it is completely safe. It's not. It just isn't. But it is a lesser risk. And then encourage the safe storage of juice. I can't emphasize that enough because of children. And then warn them about the continuing nicotine addiction. So my friend who is using an electronic cigarette to help him, I don't know whether it's quit or maintain his tobacco use at this point, but he's cut down, on advice to lower and lower levels of nicotine. But he finally got to the point where he was thinking about going back to smoking. So you can't just say go ahead and do it and then let it go. You really do need to, if that's the way your patient's going to go, I would suggest that be a question that gets asked every time you see them. I'm not advocating for or against electronic cigarettes. I think it's a personal decision, but obviously I would advocate for complete tobacco cessation first, and harm reduction would only be if that wasn't an option. So, what about adult vapers? What about the folks that have already switched from traditional cigarettes to vaping, or they were youth who started with vaping and are now over the age of 21 or 25, whenever you consider them an adult for care? Of course, assess for vaping when you're asking about tobacco, because it will not be answered yes as though it's smoking. It is a different answer for them. Advise no tobacco use, and counsel again that it's not risk-free. Warn of continuing nicotine addiction, and refer them to tobacco cessation services. We are now treating folks that are still nicotine addicted through electronic cigarettes who have given up traditional cigarettes. We're treating them similarly to how we treat traditional cigarette users. A lot depends on their use. It's harder to assess because it depends on the nicotine in the juice. It depends on the strength of the battery, the type of delivery. So our recommendation is that you assess it and then advise about it. And as far as, I think you have to tell the whole story. It's not risk-free. It may or may not help you. Let's try traditional methods first. What we're finding is with the patients who tried traditional methods and were not successful, they're hesitant to do them again. But I would suggest that first, absolutely. So I just wanted to mention the nicotine addiction pharmacotherapy, because this could also be used. Remember, if they're using enough nicotine, one method that's been recommended is that they cut down on the nicotine in the juice, which they can do. But at some point, you might want to think about traditional pharmacotherapy for the vapors in your practice. And again, this is just a list of the most common ones, which is bupropion, varenicline, nicotine patch, nicotine gum, and then the inhaler. The reason I mention the inhaler over some of the other alternative nicotine replacement is I've had quite a few smokers and vapors tell me that the technique is similar enough that they kind of liked that. It's very expensive, so their insurance would have to cover it. And then what I tell folks who you probably hear this frequently, I can't afford. Vaping is much less expensive than smoking. Even getting the most expensive model, and it is about $100 or more to get the initial, some of the kits, the initial kits, they're fairly expensive, but once you make that investment, it's a lot less expensive. I didn't bring that particular slide, but I've looked at it, and depending on whether you do your own juice, so refillable, versus buying the pre-filled cartridges, versus buying the disposable electronic cigarettes, the difference in cost can be up to 1/5 of the cost of traditional cigarettes. So that is another consideration, is understanding the cost piece of this. So when you start thinking about quitting, varenicline, nicotine inhaler, even bupropion, well, not bupropion so much, but they're pretty expensive. So if they're, depending on what insurance they have and how much coverage they have, it would make a big difference. The only other thing that I particularly wanted to mention is that we're seeing these downward trends, but sometimes that's a result of how we collect the data. So I'm not aware of that there was a difference in the last year or two, but I can't promise you there wasn't. So it'll be interesting to see if that trend continues. Do you have any questions? Yes?
Is there a test, like if you have an underage child and you suspect that maybe they're doing this, is there a test for nicotine?
So is there a test of nicotine? Yes, there are several. There's a blood test, there's a urine test, and there's a saliva test. You can get a saliva test. I think it's only about, the little kit is only about $7 or $8, and it will show if they've used nicotine. They say the last 30 days, but it's really not quite that long. It's probably more like about 20. Yes, you absolutely can. Yes?
How do insurance companies look at smoking versus vaping? I mean, are they consider it the same?
Okay, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that because they've not really come out and said anything one way or the other. What insurance companies have traditionally asked, and I'm unaware that they've changed this, is if you're a smoker. But now I think they're asking, in the last few years, are you a tobacco user? And so I believe the answer for tobacco use would still be yes, and so it would be treated the same. But that may be a changing policy. I'm unaware of it. Yes?
Can you tell by odor or something, do they give off, any of them give off enough odor that you could tell whether your child's been smoking or anything?
Okay, so actually you reminded me of a point I wanted to make that I've overlooked. So thank you for that question. So do e-cigarettes give, or vape devices give off an odor? Not really, not like traditional cigarettes do. They don't, but, and I'm thinking you could probably guess the answer to this. What else do you think youth in particular and young adults might be using the refillable vape devices for? Marijuana, absolutely. So yes, and what I've heard, and I'm not a witness to this, so I can't tell you for sure, but what I've heard is that it does not produce the same odor that when you vape marijuana juice, that it does not produce the same odor that when you typically use it. So it's a discreet way of smoking pot, is my understanding. So, you know, the other thing that we've heard is that a lot of the kids who start vaping then will start smoking pot that way. But that's not strong evidence because now that more states it's legal, we'll probably get better information on that.
Is there going to be a Marlboro man on a horse vaporing?
Isn't there already? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, you've seen the commercials. I think Blue was one of the first products that had a lot of, there's been commercials, and they mimic very closely the original cigarette commercials from like the 50s and 60s. Yes?
Is there any evidence at all that vaping can be used by people to help cut down the use of smokeless tobacco?
So vaping for smokeless, as a way to quit smokeless tobacco, I have not seen any reports of that. That doesn't mean there isn't one, but I've not seen it. That's a good question. I don't know. Yes?
You mentioned that some people, I guess vendors or people that sell this, they mix their own juice. Is there any type of regulations for sterile, procedures, or you just kind of use it your own?
So the FDA is supposed to be ruling on all of that. My understanding is that there's not really a system in place yet. They're not being inspected like you would expect for like a lab or something, no. Not yet. It's coming, eventually. Yes, ma'am.
You had said that the cherry flavoring had a detrimental effect. What was that effect that it had?
It was a greater irritation in the lungs, and I think there was some chemical in the, and I'm sorry, I'm not a chemist, so this is not my area, but there was a chemical within the cherry flavoring that was considered a carcinogenic that was part of the inhalation. Mm-hmm. Pardon?
Allergies, do they say allergies?
Are there allergies? I do not know the answer to that. I don't think I've seen anything on that.
If they're adding things to it.
So like if somebody was allergic to something and then that was the additive flavor, depends on, I guess, probably on whether it was a natural flavoring or an artificial flavoring. But I don't know the answer. Sorry. Okay, thank you very much.